Over the past year, wealth concentration accelerated sharply. The top 1% added more to their net worth than in any other year on record, even as interest rates stayed high and inflation remained persistent. This didn't come from speculation or sudden risk taking. The gains came from a familiar framework that has quietly built billions over decades. The original buy, borrow, die strategy applied with more precision under tighter financial conditions. I'm Alex. Today I'll walk through how buy, borrow, die originally worked, why changing financial conditions are pushing the wealthy to upgrade it to buy, borrow, die 2.0, and how this updated version amplifies the same mechanics, explaining why capital is moving this way right now, and how the same structure can be applied at a smaller scale. And to see how this plays out in real life, let's start with two investors who entered the same market in the same year, with nearly identical properties but ended up in very different places. Daniel versus Morgan. Same start, 1 year wealth split. Daniel and Morgan entered the same market with nearly identical rental properties, each valued around $500,000. Same street. Similar tenants. Comparable expenses. There was no visible advantage on day one. Daniel chose closure. He sold the property, paid roughly $50,000 in capital gains tax, and parked about $450,000 in savings. The move felt disciplined. Clean exit, no leverage, no surprises. Morgan stayed put. The property still carried a small balance, about $50,000, at a low fixed rate. Instead of selling, Morgan opened a line of credit against the equity. The rate was higher, but ownership stayed intact. 12 months later, the contrast showed up quietly. Daniel's cash balance hadn't moved much, but prices had. Groceries cost more. Insurance rose. The same dollars covered less. Meanwhile, the property he sold appreciated without him. Morgan's ledger moved differently. Two properties were now in play. Rent covered both payments. Depreciation reduced taxable income. Equity increased each month. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. Add the numbers. Daniel absorbed taxes, inflation, and missed appreciation that pushed total opportunity cost into six figures. Morgan generated cash flow, about $740 a month, while building equity on two fronts. Same market, same year. One choice optimized for certainty, the other quietly compounded. Why 2026 changes everything. Interest rates are higher than they were a few years ago, but that's only part of the shift. What matters more is how those rates interact with inflation taxes and access to capital. In 2026, cash no longer behaves like a safe default. Savings accounts lag rising prices. Even at 5% yield, inflation quietly eats the spread. The result feels stable month to month, then disappointing over a full year. Debt behaves differently. Fixed-rate loans lock in yesterday's dollars. Rents and asset prices adjust upward. The gap between what you owe and what your assets produce widens without extra effort. At the same time, the tools changed. Borrowing is no longer limited to traditional purchase mortgages. Lines of credit, asset-backed lending, private capital pools, and digital collateral expanded access while reducing friction. Liquidity shows up faster and often without triggering taxes. This environment rewards ownership and punishes liquidation. Selling converts productive assets into exposed cash. Holding keeps the engine running while time does the work. What surprises most people is that higher rates didn't kill leverage. They filtered it. Careless borrowing got expensive. Structured borrowing became more valuable. That's the quiet shift. The rules didn't break. They tilted. And the tilt explains why two people making reasonable decisions in the same year can end up moving in opposite directions. Original buy, borrow, die. The foundation. Buy, borrow, die starts with a simple distinction that most people overlook. Selling an asset creates a tax event. Borrowing against it does not. That single difference changes everything that follows. When someone sells a property, the gain is measured, reported, and taxed immediately. Capital gains reduce the usable proceeds on day one. The asset is gone, and so is its future growth. Cash replaces it, fully exposed to inflation and spending pressure. Borrowing works differently. When you take a loan against an asset, the tax code doesn't treat that money as income. There's no capital gains tax, no income tax, just liquidity secured by something you still own. Meanwhile, the asset keeps doing its job. Real estate continues to appreciate over time. Tenants keep paying rent. That rent services the debt, and builds equity quietly month after month. Depreciation offsets taxable income along the way, even though the property's market value may be rising. This is why wealthy balance sheets look strange from the outside. High asset values, significant debt, very little taxable income. It isn't accidental, it's structural. The strategy isn't about avoiding work or risk. It's about sequencing. Buy assets that grow. Borrow instead of selling when you need capital. Delay taxes legally by staying invested. And the final step comes later when ownership ends. That's where the real asymmetry appears. The moment most people reveal their bias. Pause for a moment and imagine a sudden advantage. You own a property that's appreciated sharply. Equity is sitting there accessible. No emergency, no pressure, just a choice. Option 1 feels clean. Sell the asset, pay the tax, lock in certainty. The account balance jumps overnight and the decision feels finished. Option 2 feels bold. Borrow heavily and expand fast. Add properties. Scale quickly. Let leverage do the work and hope growth stays ahead of the risk. Option 3 feels quieter. Keep the asset. Borrow conservatively. Preserve a wide margin. Let rent's time and structure compound without forcing speed. Each choice reveals something different. Selling prioritizes relief over capacity. Aggressive expansion prioritizes speed over durability. Holding prioritizes staying power over visible progress. Here's what's often missed. The outcome isn't decided by intelligence or effort. It's decided by how much uncertainty you can tolerate without needing resolution. The tax code rewards patience. Inflation punishes finality. Debt favors structure over urgency. Most people don't lose money because they chose poorly. They lose flexibility because they chose to feel done. The system quietly favors the option that keeps doors open. So which option would you choose when nothing is forcing your hand cash? Now speed now or capacity later? The answer tends to predict which balance sheet still works years down the line. Real estate as the engine plus, the die effect Trump Tower example. Consider Trump Tower. It isn't just a building. It's a machine that compounds quietly. Over time, the property increases in value. Tenants pay rent every month. Those payments don't just cover expenses, they reduce the mortgage. Equity builds whether the owner takes action or not. On paper, depreciation lowers taxable income, even while market value rises. The books show less income. The balance sheet shows more wealth. When capital is needed, the owner doesn't sell the asset. Selling would trigger capital gains and break the engine. Instead, the asset is pledged as collateral. Cash is borrowed. That cash isn't income, so it isn't taxed. The building keeps appreciating. Rent keeps coming in. The loan is serviced by the property itself. Now the same dollars are working twice. One asset in Manhattan continues to grow. New capital funds, another project may be a second property in a different market. Growth stacks without liquidation. The final step is the part most people never see. When ownership transfers, the tax basis resets to current market value. Decades of appreciation disappear for tax purposes. Gains that were deferred don't resurface. They vanish. That's why the strategy isn't about making money quickly. It's about keeping productive assets alive long enough for the rules to change in your favor, without anyone noticing while it happens. Upgrade number 1. Creative financing, Morgan's HELOC move. Morgan didn't look for a new deal. The deal was already there sitting inside the property. The original mortgage balance was low, about $50,000, at a fixed 4%. Most people would see that as a reason to sell. Morgan saw it as unused capacity. Instead of refinancing the whole property at today's higher rates, Morgan opened a line of credit against the existing equity. The rate was higher, around 7%, but only on the borrowed portion. The original cheap debt stayed untouched. That distinction matters. The blended cost of capital stayed manageable. Monthly payments rose, but not dramatically. Roughly $1,400 all in. The borrowed cash funded a second property. That property produced short-term rental income of about $3,100 a month. After expenses, the numbers still cleared. Cash flow stayed positive from day one. Here's the quiet advantage. 2 assets now appreciated instead of 1. 2 tenants paid down 2 loans. Depreciation applied twice. The tax profile improved while leverage increased. Traditional bank loans slow this process down. Appraisals resets full refinances. Creative financing works around that friction. It adds capacity without resetting the entire balance sheet. The move didn't rely on optimism, it relied on structure. Cheap debt was protected, expensive debt was productive. The property didn't just sit there, it became a funding source that didn't require selling the engine to keep it running. Upgrade number 2, inflation as a weapon. Most people experience inflation as erosion. Prices rise, savings feel smaller, waiting feels punished. But debt reacts very differently. When you borrow at a fixed rate, the number you owe is locked. Inflation doesn't increase that balance, it works against it. Each year, the dollars used to repay the loan are worth slightly less than the dollars originally borrowed. Assets move the opposite way. Real estate adjusts upward over time. Rents reset, replacement costs rise. Property values respond to inflation faster than wages do. The asset inflates while the liability stays still. This is where the asymmetry appears. A $500,000 loan taken today is repaid with cheaper dollars tomorrow, while the property tied to it reflects today's higher prices. The gap widens quietly. Most people try to outrun inflation by holding cash or chasing yield. The wealthy step aside and let inflation do the work for them. They hold productive assets and fixed obligations, not flexible expenses. Notice what's happening underneath. Inflation punishes finality. Selling converts assets into cash that loses value. Holding keeps you inside the system, where prices adjust in your favor. That's why leverage didn't disappear when inflation rose. It became selective. Bad debt got dangerous. Structured debt became useful. The strategy isn't betting on inflation. It's positioning so that if inflation persists, time works for you. And if it doesn't, the asset still stands there producing income, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Upgrade number 3, digital asset integration. The strategy doesn't stop with real estate. The collateral pool expanded. Wealthy investors no longer rely on property alone to access liquidity. Digital assets entered the balance sheet not as speculation, but as collateral. The key difference is simple borrowing doesn't trigger a sale. Take a holder with roughly $400,000 in Bitcoin. Selling would create a taxable event and shrink exposure. Instead, the asset is pledged on platforms like BlockFi or Nexo. A loan is issued often around 50% of value at rates, comparable to traditional credit. That borrowed cash buys a small apartment building. Rent services the loan. The digital asset remains owned. Two assets now move independently, both working. Tokenized real estate adds another layer. Smaller positions across multiple properties can be pledged without bank applications, appraisals, or long closing timelines. Liquidity arrives quickly. No sale, no tax reset. What matters isn't the technology, it's the behavior shift. Assets that were once illiquid become usable without liquidation. Capital moves without breaking ownership chains. This changes the rhythm of investing. Instead of waiting for exits, investors recycle capacity. Liquidity appears when needed, then disappears as loans are repaid. The assets stay put. The quiet risk is volatility, which is why leverage stays conservative. The quiet advantage is flexibility. When liquidity can be pulled without selling decisions stop being forced. That's the pattern repeating. Ownership first, liquidity second, taxes last if ever. Upgrade number 4, private lending networks. Banks aren't the only source of capital anymore, and in many cases, they're not the fastest or the cheapest. Private lending networks operate quietly alongside the traditional system. Instead of underwriting based on income, W-2s, or credit optics, they focus on one thing, the asset itself. If the deal works, the capital moves. Here's how the contrast shows up in practice. A commercial property needs $400,000 to close. A bank offers the loan at around 7.8%, requires a personal guarantee, and sets a 45-day timeline. The deal sits in limbo. Through a private lending network, the same loan closes in 10 days. The rate drops closer to 4.9%. Payments are interest only for the first year. No personal guarantee. The asset stands on its own. Speed is part of the advantage, but alignment matters more. These lenders care about downside protection, not paperwork perfection. They move faster because they aren't bound by the same regulatory friction. Once inside these networks, roles blur. Today's borrower becomes tomorrow's lender. Capital doesn't sit idle. It circulates, earning on both sides of the table. That's the quiet shift. Banks sell products. Private lenders deploy capital. When access to money depends more on asset quality than approval cycles, opportunity stops waiting for permission. The result isn't more risk, it's fewer bottlenecks. And in markets where timing decides outcomes, the difference compounds faster than most people expect. Safety rules: why the wealthy don't blow up. Leverage isn't what breaks people, overreach does. The first rule is simple and non-negotiable. Never borrow more than 75% of an asset's value. On a $500,000 property, that caps total debt at $375,000. For newer investors, the real number is lower, closer to 60%. That unused equity isn't wasted. It's shock absorption. The second rule is reserves. Every property carries 6 months of coverage minimum. Mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, expected maintenance. On a typical property, that means $15,000 to $20,000 in cash sitting untouched. Not invested, not optimized, just ready. The third rule is cash flow. Every asset must pay for itself after all costs are counted. Mortgage, insurance, maintenance, management, vacancy. The target isn't impressive returns, it's reliability. Wealthy investors look for at least $200 per unit per month after everything. These rules don't accelerate growth. They prevent forced decisions. Markets don't usually collapse all at once. They tighten slowly. Liquidity dries up. Refinancing gets harder. The people who fail aren't wrong about the long term. They just run out of room. That's the quiet discipline behind the strategy. Expansion is optional. Survival isn't. The goal is staying solvent long enough for time to do its job without ever needing to sell at the wrong moment. How to access these networks. Access usually starts closer than people expect. Not online, not through ads, through proximity. Commercial mortgage brokers are often the first gatekeepers. They see deals before banks do. They know which lenders move quickly, which ones care about assets instead of credit optics, and which terms are negotiable. One conversation can shortcut months of trial and error. Local real estate investment associations are another entry point. Not the crowded seminars, the side conversations, the repeat names that show up on deals. These investors often lend privately themselves or introduce others who do. Capital circulates through trust, not marketing. What surprises most people is how informal these networks are. No dashboards, no applications, just reputation track record and clear numbers. Deals get funded because they make sense, not because boxes are checked. There's also a quieter path. Some banks collaborate on zero-interest capital programs for borrowers with solid credit and clean histories. No bankruptcies, no recent collections. Access is capped, but the cost of capital is effectively zero for a limited window. The common thread is relationship, not leverage. These networks don't reward excitement. They reward clarity. When capital providers trust the asset and the structure speed replaces permission, that's the shift. Money moves towards certainty, not persuasion. And once inside these circles, access compounds. The next deal gets easier, then faster, then expected. Key takeaways. What separates outcomes in this system isn't intelligence, effort, or timing. It's how long someone can stay inside productive ownership without forcing closure. Selling feels responsible because it creates certainty. Borrowing feels uncomfortable because it delays resolution. The structure quietly rewards the second behavior. Assets that remain intact keep adjusting with inflation, taxes, and time. Assets that are sold stop participating immediately. Across every section, the same pattern repeats. Liquidity is most powerful when it appears without liquidation. Debt becomes useful when it's fixed, limited, and tied to income-producing assets. Risk is rarely the act of borrowing itself. It's borrowing without margin. The wealthy don't win by predicting markets. They win by preserving optionality. They design balance sheets that survive tightening, waiting, and boredom. Once you see that, the strategy stops looking clever and starts looking inevitable. The system doesn't favor speed. It favors those who can stay solvent long enough for the rules to do the compounding on their behalf.